Hello there and welcome to another episode of The Partial Historians, and yet something totally new. I am Dr. Radness.
That is not new. I am Dr. Greenfield. Welcome.
We're starting a new venture today, which is why we're slightly new.
Stepping into the past.
We're partially new.
Well, it's a partially new topic, I suppose you could say. We're venturing back into the mists of the beginnings of Roman history.
Indeed.
This could take us a long time.
Yes, we're going to take a bit of a chronological survey, we've decided. We will stop off every now and then to explore things as they interest us, but essentially we're going from the beginnings of Rome until the end, I guess.
Right until the end.
It'll take us a while. And so, as you may perhaps be expecting, that means that this week our exciting topic is the founding of Rome itself.
Where better to start? Rome, it's a place. Presumably it exists geographically in the midst of time.
Yes.
There are a controversial few stories about how Rome comes into existence.
Indeed.
But by far the most popular,
yes,
I think, is the story of the twins.
Indeed. And their story stretches far, far back, Dr. G. I think you know where I'm going with this. Oh, yes. Be prepared for a quote.
Ooh.
I sing about arms and a man who is exiled by fate, and first came to Italy from the coast of Troy and to the shores of Lavinia. He was thrown about on the land and the sea endlessly by the will of the gods, by the ruthless fury of cruel Juno. He suffered in war for too long a time. In the end, he founded a city and carried his gods to Latium. The Latin people came from this, the rulers of Alba Longa and the walls of majestic Rome.
Sounds a little bit like the opening of the Aeneid by Virgil.
Oh, you are 100% correct. Give that woman a doctorate. Oh, wait, she's already got one.
Hello.
Yes.
So, Rome founded by Aeneas?
Well, not exactly.
Damn it!
Yeah. I think you
What a
already knew the
build-up.
answer to that one. You were just trying to make me sound intelligent for once. Yeah.
I do what I can.
Yeah, well, basically, we are on the mark, though. We have to go back to Troy for the popular sort of imagining of this story.
There are two conceptualizations of the beginning of Rome. One of them arguably is the Greek version of the story.
Sure.
And that would be Aeneas.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, and Aeneas, basically, the idea is that he escapes from the destruction that happens at the end of the Trojan War.
Yes.
And after,
one of the survivors.
Yeah. And after bouncing about a bit,
spending a long time at sea.
Yeah, and the idea that
breaking some hearts.
He was sort of fated to survive because he's going to, found a new Troy, that sort of thing.
He has some of the gods on his side.
Yeah, not all though. The cruel Juno, hello. Yeah, but eventually he gives up on his, casual love affair with Dido.
Wound to the heart.
Exactly, yeah. And too much more, given that she dies. He eventually founds this new land.
Yeah, so we have this settlement, Alba Longa, and you think to yourself, okay, Aeneas has founded Alba Longa, which is in Italy, it's in Latium.
We're getting close, yeah.
That ain't no Rome.
No.
I hear you. That is distinctly not Rome.
No.
There is a competing foundation story for the city of Rome itself. And this is where the Romulus and Remus legend comes into play. Now, there is some controversy about how these two stories intermesh, overlay each other. If the Aeneas version of events is the Greek sort of take on things, then the Romulus and Remus story seems to more conventionally be the sort of indigenous native story of what is going on in Italy.
That somehow got worked into the...
Yeah, and there's various ways that they navigate around this.
Yeah.
One of them is to suggest that there's about 15 generations between Aeneas and Romulus and Remus.
Yeah,
to sort of account for the time difference between the end of the Trojan
War. He basically finds Italy.
Finds Italy, yeah. It's very exciting. The Greeks have discovered a new land.
And eventually, descendants will
Some
found.
of those descendants.
Yeah.
eventually found Rome.
Yes.
So, yeah, arguably the Greeks can be like, well, you know, Rome is really a Greek city.
Yeah.
No. Forget that.
And there's that connection to mythical Troy. Yes.
Well, it's always good to have gods involved in the founding of your city. That seems to be a good
and we are in
auspice.
such a hazy area right now because it's so tied up in, you know, the myths of time. It's very hard to unpack, you know, what actually happened because it's so...
Well, I'm going to venture to say that we can't actually unpack what happened.
Yeah.
And I'm down with that.
Yeah.
As a historian...
So if we were hoping we were actually going to give you a historical account of how Rome came to be prepared for disappointment.
Sorry in advance. Our source material doesn't lend itself to that sort of reading.
No.
But what it does lend itself to really nicely is how Rome... or how Romans in later generations conceptualize their own history.
Yes. And the descendants of Aeneas that supposedly have this connection to Romulus and Remus eventually. Numitor and Julius. Indeed, yes. In that these people eventually come about in Alba Longa.
So Numitor is
brothers,
Amulius and Numitor, the brothers that rule Alba Longa. But controversially for brothers, or perhaps not controversially for brothers, they disagree about who should be in charge.
Big surprise.
Yeah. Brothers. Nothing like power to split up a family.
Yes.
Numitor sort of gets thrown out a little bit.
Yeah.
Just a tad.
Yeah.
Amulius takes over.
Yeah. But of course there always has to be that fear of what might happen if there's vengeance in the room.
Well, you know, once you've decided to break with family and blood being thicker than water, you need to eliminate all of the other blood. It becomes quite important.
And this is where I know you're going to get excited.
Ooh, yes.
Because I believe Numitor has a daughter.
He does.
And what's a good way of making sure that a daughter of your, I suppose, enemy now has no children?
Oh, you know, it's really good if you stick her into a cult for virgins.
Yeah.
That really helps.
Cult would be
the Vestal Virgins of Alba Longa. Not to be confused with the Vestal Virgins of Rome.
Yes.
Because Rome doesn't exist yet.
No, exactly. And so that's exactly what he does. He takes the wise path of deciding that he'll just stop that line of descent by making her be a virgin forever. Yeah,
which, you know, would work really well if the gods weren't already involved.
Sneaky.
Yeah. So, I mean, according to Livy's account, which... and Livy prefaces all of this account of early Rome by suggesting that
it's not entirely true.
Well, that it is the privilege of antiquity to mingle divine things with human, and so add dignity to the beginnings of cities. So consider the entry of Mars into this story, the addition of dignity,
and the rape.
Because there's nothing quite as dignified as raping a woman sleeping by the bank of a river, who also
and doing it so thoroughly that she falls pregnant.
Yeah, not just with one child, but with twins.
Oh dear. And so you would imagine that eventually people notice that this virgin is pregnant. Would you not?
Yes.
Yeah.
She tried to keep that secret.
Yeah. Leaks out.
You know, she had the good women folk in her life hide her, so her physical condition would remain unknown.
Yes.
But people got rather suspicious of her absence from public, and it became imperative from Amulius's perspective that this child, this pregnancy, whatever issue came from that would be destroyed.
Yes,
so
be taken care of.
Yes. So he sent orders. If you're feeling sort of parallels to the Moses story, I think you really should just go with that feeling.
Yeah.
These children, these babies, once removed from the womb, are ordered to be destroyed.
They are, I might add, apparently rather impressive physical specimens, as you would expect from descendants of a god.
Really?
Yeah. Indeed, they are apparently impressive physical specimens.
They're babies.
Nonetheless, they can be impressive.
I don't know what would be impressive about a baby.
Well, you know what? Having had a little bit of exposure to real-life twins, maybe it's the fact that twins tend to come early and therefore be a bit scrawny. Maybe they just weren't.
Maybe they were
like two totally individually born.
Wow.
Who knows?
Impressive.
Yeah. Either way, yes.
In any case, some odd things happen to these babies. The order is given out. The servants of Romulus rock up to take the children away. There's obviously the distressing sort of separation from the mother.
Yeah.
There's also some flooding that's taking place.
Handy.
In and around Avalonga. And so there's like high water levels, and so they sort of toss the children into the water of the river.
But they kind of are at the edge, aren't they?
They're kind of at the edge.
They don't go far enough.
Yeah, and they sort of think the servants apparently think to themselves that, oh, look, nature will take its course and these children won't survive.
Yeah.
How wrong they were.
They thought, job done.
Yeah, the morally culpable action of actually murdering these babies is not something that these servants end up being able to do.
Yeah.
So they think to themselves, look, it's a raging river, what are the chances, life will take care of itself from here.
And indeed life does.
And it does.
With divine intervention.
It does. It does.
The babies are luckily discovered.
They are. Now this is where the story gets relatively interesting.
Yeah.
And I know it was interesting up until now. They are found by a shepherd.
Indeed. Faustulus, is it not? Faustulus? Faustulus.
I'm going with Faustulus.
Okay, I like that too.
But Faustulus has a much more sort of Germanic sound to it. I suppose you could run with that too.
Yes, so he discovers them. And they had been kind of being looked after by a she-wolf, had they not?
Yes.
In the interim?
Yes.
Being suckled by a she-wolf. And this is where that, legendary image of the twins being, sitting underneath the she-wolf and suckling at her teat.
Yeah. Now, this is where the story gets really weird.
Yeah. And where myth probably playing a part.
Maybe. I mean, in some cases, the she-wolf is just sort of licking the children. The children are like, wow.
Awesome.
Being licked by
Selfie
a wolf.
opportunity.
Yeah. In any case, Faustulus is a bit worried about this and suspects that maybe something has gone wrong with the destruction of the twins of Avalonga, which was obviously doing the traps around the neighbourhood.
Yeah.
So he sort of rushes off and finds his wife, brings her and some other people back. So there's a gang of menfolk now.
Yeah.
And the wolf sort of runs off, as you do.
Job done.
Yeah.
Save the babies.
Yeah. And goes and hides in some sort of cave, which becomes the Lupercal. Hello.
Yeah.
And anyway, so they're found, and it's partially on the Palatine, or what will become the Palatine, that they're discovered, and then Faustulus' wife becomes involved, Laurentia.
Yes.
And the trouble with her is that
she's a woman of not great reputation.
Yeah, well, she also has a connection to the idea of the wolf. It's like the Latin lupa.
Yes. And this is where scholars aren't sure if maybe
the she-wolf is
the
Laurentia.
Exactly, yeah. Because slang for, a prostitute is like a she-wolf, basically, in Latin. It's like...
Yes.
Yeah, lupus, lupe,
Yeah.
And so they're not sure if maybe at one point it was meant to be that the wife of the shepherd was suckling or looking after the twins, and maybe there was no wolf at all.
Yes.
Maybe. But then again, the wolf is, also sort of could be a symbol of the wilderness, and perhaps associated with Mars, and therefore perhaps there was actually a wolf there. And
it's a bit of a double-edged symbol, this one.
Exactly.
This is one that comes to bite the Romans later on.
Yeah.
Aha!
Nice then.
I just realised as I said it.
Yeah.
But it does mean that the Romans get maligned at certain points.
Yeah. Because, having a prostitute.
The idea,
that's a heroine, I suppose.
Well, yeah, that the functional mother of these children is possibly a prostitute.
Yeah,
dubious.
Even she's not a prostitute, and she's just a good time gal. Not a good.
Yeah. This plays into expectations about gender in the ancient Roman world quite strongly.
Yes, but either way, I suppose.
Well, importantly, the children live.
Yes, exactly. And they continue to distinguish themselves with their physical appearance and feats.
Yeah. Well, they grow up, they become hunters, they accrue their own gangs, as it were, to go roving through the forests of the local area.
Yeah.
They learn the
taking care of business.
Yeah, well, they learn the trade of the shepherd, but they also end up engaging in a whole bunch of sort of like daylight robberies.
Yeah, very strange.
They do a bit of the Robin Hood thing where they steal from the rich to give to the poor. Yeah. But this like teenage ganghoodness that they get involved in does become a point of conflict for them as well, because this is how they get drawn back into the attention of people like Amulius.
Don't tell me. One of them does something bad and they get arrested.
Yes.
Or taken into custody, I should perhaps say.
Yeah, so Remus gets captured and is
doing one of these hijinks.
Yeah, one of these gangster bro in the forest things.
Yeah.
Gets captured and is taken to Amulius and then eventually transferred into the care of Numitor, because even though Numitor, Amulius's brother, has been chucked out of power, he still has his own land holdings. And apparently the crime for which Remus has been captured for has happened on Numitor's property.
Exactly, yeah. And it's kind of his responsibility to take.
So he needs to deal with that.
Yeah, exactly.
So
he sees his grandchild for the first time.
Yeah. Not realizing. Ooh, dramatic irony.
Exactly. But the pieces of the puzzle begin to fall into place when Romulus also gets involved.
Yeah. So we get this sense in which Romulus is not very happy about the situation with Remus.
Fair enough.
And decides to stage a rescue.
Yeah.
Gotta break my bro out.
Yeah.
And this leads to a set of conversations between Numitor and Remus.
Yes.
Where they both kind of reach an understanding that perhaps Remus is his grandchild.
Yes, exactly. The bits of the puzzle are falling into place.
Yeah, like he's the right age, and Numitor's inclined to believe it, and Romulus turns up, and they all sort of band together, and Numitor, Remus, and Romulus are like, all right, let's take down Amulius. Let's do this thing for real.
Let's claim it back. What is our right?
Yeah, I don't know what Numitor was thinking, but now he's got this, like, these young, like, grandsons. He's like, I acknowledge you guys.
Handily the sons of God.
Yeah. Let us do this thing. Yes. I want the power now. How about that? And they go and they slay Amulius.
Yeah, with their band of
Success. And none of this is getting us closer to the founding of the city.
No, because
wait for it.
The twins don't say, "Well, I guess we'll take over now because we're young and virile and whatnot." They just restore their grandfather to his position of power as the ruler of Albalonga. Yeah, and they basically then say, and by the by, we might just go and found ourselves a city, if that's okay by you.
Well, yeah, I mean, Numitor gets up in front of everybody after all of this incident, because obviously it's like shaking up the power structure of Albalonga.
You would imagine.
It's a little bit chaotic. Everyone's like, what is going on here?
Wait a minute, you're not our king.
Yeah, we know you, but you look familiar. Yeah. You have not been here for a while.
No.
And Numitor's like, look, what you need to understand is that these are my grandsons. Yeah. And so he openly acknowledges them, and everyone's like, oh, that's cool. All right, sweet.
Awesome story, guys.
Yeah.
This could be like a story that lives through the ages.
Yeah. Those twins are impressive, aren't they? Yeah. And so everybody in Albalonga seems to get on board with this idea of Numitor being restored.
Yeah.
Romulus and Remus being legitimate relations.
Yeah.
And Romulus and Remus are then like, well, we've done this gangster thing for a while, and this has been really fun and all, but maybe
it's time to be mature about it.
Yeah, maybe what we should do is like get our own city.
Yeah.
Like that's
and settle down, you know.
Yeah. That's probably the thing.
So they wander off and found what will be the site.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because there's this passage in Livy where we get this transition really quickly from like Romulus and Remus are both seized by a desire to sort of found a city for themselves in the region where they were brought up.
Yeah.
Which is obviously just on the outskirts of the Albalonga region.
Yes.
And then they're in it together at that point. And then
rapidly.
Very quickly, not a lot of explanation for what goes wrong.
One of them ends up dead.
They decide that, like, even though they've been seized by the same desire to found a place together...
It's not going to be the same place necessarily.
Well, I mean, it is, but they decide that, like...
But not the same... They're not going to go about it the same way, and they don't get along as they found it.
Well, they both want to found a place where they were found.
Yeah.
By the shepherd.
Yes.
And then, but they don't want to share power.
Brothers.
So I don't know. I don't know why co-rulership would be so anathema to them. But
especially since they're twins.
They're twins.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's this weird transition from like they both want to found a city and they seem to be in it together, and then they get
and they agree on the location.
Yeah, location is the thing, and they get there and they get to the spot and they're like, I reckon I should found this city.
Yeah.
There becomes this distinction. So rather than being a shared subject, they enter into this sort of I'm an individual and you're an. Maybe we can't do this together.
And there are also stories of them like Romulus starting to, build the city walls, what will be like the sacred boundary of the city, and Remus going, you call that a wall? Suck on this! I'm going to leap over your stupid wall.
Maybe
and that being the reason that Romulus kills him. Very suddenly, I would think.
It's unfortunate. So, things take a dark turn.
Yeah.
Once they decide to get competitive with each other, it's all about, like, competing auguries.
Yeah.
And so...
Yeah, exactly. What they do, they go off and, like, sit down, and one of them sees, 6? Is it 6 or is it 12?
Yeah. So, like, Remus sees 6 vultures, according to Livy.
Yeah.
And he's like, I've had my augury.
Yeah.
And he relays that information quite quickly to everybody who needs to know.
Yeah.
At which point, Romulus is like, well, I've seen 12.
Twice that many.
I've seen 12.
Yeah.
How about that for augury?
Yeah. Exactly.
And, it's like everything that bound these two together, all of their shared suffering as children. And
just unravels amazingly quickly.
Yes. And perhaps, was foreshadowed by, their grandfathers falling out as well.
Maybe,
Maybe you just can't have 2 men share power. But things get out of hand and,
regardless of the reason for their dispute, they definitely have a dispute.
It escalates to a physical thing.
Yeah.
Remus comes off second best.
Yeah.
And Romulus gets to be
the
founder of Rome.
Woo!
A city founded on the story of rape, pillage.
Yes. Because Romulus doesn't stop there. After he's set things up, and in order to attract people to his city, he apparently says, that most people, regardless of your previous reputation, can come and live in his new city.
Yeah, so he sets up a sanctuary for men, essentially.
Yeah.
Where he says, come, I've got a space, all your past will be forgiven.
Exactly.
Come,
no judgment.
Yeah, come to Rome.
Yeah.
They get a goodly number of people rock up.
But the problem is, too many of them are of the masculine gender.
Well,
apparently.
It is a sanctuary for men.
Yes.
So...
And this is an issue, eventually.
Well, yeah. So they organise a structure from within the people who have rocked up to this sanctuary, and they decide, who was the most respectful out of all of these, and designate about 100 of them to be the fathers, if you like. This, and they become, essentially, the patrician class.
Yeah.
And Romulus does a whole bunch of things to sort of augment his own power visually. This idea of having lictors, these people in front of you who carry the fasces.
Signal who you are.
Yeah. And he adopts the trappings of power that come from the Etruscans, according to Livy. Things like fancy chairs, curule chair.
Fancy chair.
Gotta have a fancy chair. and the purple bordered toga. And he does all of these things. And so he's got the visual aspect going on.
Yep.
He's got some men in place.
Yep.
He's got a sort of nascent patrician class.
Order is coming about.
He's created some order. And they're like, okay, so we've got a location, we've got some power, we've got some people involved. This thing is really, it's going viral. This is what we want.
It's a trend and it's taking off.
Yeah. And then they're like, you know what we need? Women.
Yeah.
And they do some really interesting things. They send out a whole bunch of emissaries to all of the local surrounding communities. They're like, would you like to... Ladies, we've got a proposition for you.
And bachelor number 1. He's got a purple bordered toga and a fancy chair.
Yes. Would you like to join us? Most people in the local area seem to be offended by this approach, and they're
perhaps because of the background of the people involved.
Well,
and the new city and whatnot.
Obviously these people are sort of like notorious characters from the local region already.
Exactly.
And so the idea that they're now rocking up and being like, so we actually have this legitimate thing now where like we've decided that we're
totally reformed. I swear to God.
Yeah. So
not just any God.
So it'd be alright if you joined us, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the envoys are sort of criticized, and the thing that gets thrown back at them is like, well, why didn't you set up a sanctuary for women as well?
Yeah.
Like, why wasn't there one for the ladies?
And they're like, too late.
Like, women, there's probably some women who would have rocked up, guys. And so they're like, oh, so you're saying no, essentially, to like joining us?
Well, that's offensive to us.
Yeah. Romulus is like, look, I've got a solution for things like that. Don't you worry. I'm going to set up some games.
Yes.
And
invite people.
Yeah, everyone should come to the games.
Yeah. Fun time.
Yeah.
Fun time had by all.
Yeah. It's the Consularia. It's going to be nice. It's going to be to Neptune. You should join us. And everyone's like, oh, sweet. We
love
games.
We're on board. 100%.
So this is like the Roman Trojan horse moment where it's like, oh, well, I'm not going to send anybody to you because frankly you guys are offensive. And then it's like, did you mention games?
Yeah. Well, we can hang out and like watch games together. Just because we don't want to give you our women folk doesn't mean we can't enjoy a good time.
Yeah. We don't hate you.
Yeah.
We just don't want to marry you.
Yeah, we just look down upon you.
Yeah. So a whole bunch of people rock up to this.
Yes. Amongst whom are the Sabines.
Well, the Sabines are probably the least clever of any of the groups because they decide that they're going to bring their women and children along as well.
Yes. It is indeed a fun time had by all. Yeah.
Yes. Women and children.
Yeah. And just when they're not thinking anything's going to happen, Romulus perhaps has something, like some signal or something set up.
He's got his man plan.
Yeah.
They wait for for everybody to be like well and truly involved in these games. And
in other words, a little intoxicated.
And then come the attacks.
Exactly. Women's
This is not something I know we sound relatively interested and excited about. This is in no way an endorsement of any of the things that are taking place in this story.
Yes. The byline of this episode is we do not find rape humorous in any shape, way or form.
Heavy sarcasm at all times.
Yeah. Exactly. We're just enjoying the fact that hopefully this isn't what actually happened.
I like to think I'm reading against a narrative rather than with the narrative.
Hopefully this is just a myth and it didn't really happen.
Yeah. I'm hoping. I'm a little bit scared that maybe it's not.
Yeah.
Anyway, in any case.
Back to our jolly mood.
Well, obviously the women resist.
Yeah.
As you do. That doesn't make things any better.
No. It doesn't go down well for them.
No, it doesn't go down very well. There are a lot of complaints about what occurs.
Yeah. Those games. My God.
Yeah, well, the Sabines are just really not very happy.
No, and as you can imagine, they kind of say, you know what, all those women that you seized, can we please have them back now?
Yeah. And part of the trouble is that we don't have a good reading on this that doesn't come from a male perspective.
No.
Because the way that Livy constructs this narrative, for instance, is that the Roman men win over the Sabine women by basically saying, look, but we're actually in love with you.
Yeah.
And that narrative of romance is what changes this from being, oh my God, they've just kidnapped and raped a whole stack of women, to being like, these women are now on board with the Roman men.
Yeah. And they're kind of like, dad, brother, be at peace with this decision. It's all good.
Yeah.
You're going to have a happy life here.
Yeah. No, this is going to be good. And do you really want to ruin the potential children that are
already in my stomach?
Yeah, that I may already have within me from this process.
Kind of reminds me actually of a classic movie about this very topic, where the women are all quite babylicious playboy types who, again, seem quite happy with the whole plan.
Yeah. To me, this doesn't seem like an accurate reading of what could have possibly happened. Nevertheless, this is the type of narrative structure that we get from this sort of mythic period.
And there's even like these sorts of images that you'll get, recreating this scene where, the Sabines and the Romans are going to go to war over this issue, this breach of hospitality in quite a spectacular way. But the women are like, madly intervening and saying, peace, stop.
Yeah.
Don't go to war. You know.
Yeah. So, this idea that the women actually become the vehicles for legitimizing this situation and what happens is both tragic and terrible and definitely part of the way the Romans saw their own history.
Yeah.
So there's no getting away from
but
the disturbing nature of it.
According to the myth, everything calms down.
Things do calm down after that, relatively speaking. Rome has some women now.
Yeah.
Those women appear to be on side, relatively speaking.
And it seems to be this sort of incorporation of the Sabines and the Romans in some versions of this story as well. Like that, through the women, there is some sort of mingling of these two peoples, according to people like Plutarch, and that that they start to try and live peacefully together in one sort of
So I mean, people, there seems to be this sense in which there are other hostile activities that take place in and around this area. After the rape of the Sabine women.
Sure.
And that's sort of where Romulus's career sort of goes from there.
Yeah. He remains much the warrior king.
I mean, there is some retaliation from the Sabines and others. They're put down because they're not very well organised, apparently.
And the Romans are kick-ass. Come on.
Well,
it's their foundation myth, of course.
They're mostly men, and it turns out that they're more well organised. This idea that eventually the Sabine women become crucial in sort of simmering down those tensions.
Yes, definitely.
Is an important part of this narrative.
I have to say, though, I mean, from a female point of view, I think the kernel of maybe truth lies in the fact that if this had happened to you, I mean, with the culture, with the times and the view of women at that time, perhaps you would make the best of a bad situation in that you are kind of damaged goods. It's a horrible way to think of things, but, how could you go back to life and,
Well, yeah, and there's no, power in this particular story is located is located solely on physical prowess.
Yeah.
And so the Sabine women are really in very little position to do anything about it.
Yeah.
Unless they decide to throw in their support with their families. Yeah. And this might tell us more about Sabine culture or culture in Italy at the time.
Sure.
And how those women were conceptualized, because it seems on the one hand there is this implied sense that those women are valuable to the Sabine people. That's why they're fighting and retaliating.
Absolutely, yeah. They're not just giving them up as lost.
Yeah. But the question about what would happen to those women if they were actually rescued and returned.
That's what I mean, what would happen
to the Sabine?
I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Yeah. To what extent are those women going to be brought back into the fold? To what extent are those women going to be valued in that society?
What kind of lives could they lead? I don't know.
Well, and it seems like the crucial question, because it seems to me that the Sabine women's reaction to what has happened is in a way a self-preservation type
totally. That's
of
what I mean.
reaction. And suggests to me that maybe there wouldn't be much for them if they were actually rescued and returned home.
Yeah.
And that perhaps there's more retribution in the offering if they were to be taken back.
Yeah.
And certainly from a Roman perspective, there does tend to be a lot of blaming the victim around instances of rape. Yeah. So, and that's a pretty strong narrative to get away from as well in this particular context.
Again, doesn't mean we agree with it. It's just the way things happen to be in this.
But what it means is that for the Romans, they've got a foundation story which on the one hand has this sort of Aeneas wandering the world, which translates into these two quite aggressive twins, who are lawbreakers, founders, engage in fratricide, engage in rape, and a city is born out of this sort of level of violence.
And I think for some people, particularly people who are, I mean, they're not really outsiders, because I'm talking about people like Plutarch, who are living in the empire, and who are, in a sense, part of that. But at the same time, who are from a sort of Greek cultural perspective. I feel like, in a way, this myth is kind of trying to explain the warlike nature of the Romans and the way, and how they came to dominate by his time, so much of the world. You know, that maybe there's that sort of connection to that sort of spirit that runs through these stories, you know.
Yeah, I mean, these stories seem to have a very sort of a long antiquity about them.
Yeah.
And
it's certainly not the only type of this story that's around, is it? I mean, you get sort of similar stories like with Perseus, you know, with his mother being thrown into a cabinet or something, a chest, when she was pregnant with him, because they were worried about, you know, what her son was going to do when he grew up, and so they just get rid of them.
Yeah, this idea that there's sort of like divine intervention, in the sense that people need to find a way to explain the past through a sort of divine lens, and accrue significance to that past as a result of that.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I mean, the basic format of the story is not, you know, you can find it in other cultures as well, not just in Roman ones, and not just in Greek ones either. Like even in Persia and places like that, you can find these sorts of stories of you know, of heroes who have, you know, illegitimate or more or less births, you know, whose mothers suffer, who go through this period of being kind of ruffians, I suppose, you know, roaming around and becoming men, and, you know, experiencing that sort of part, and then eventually sort of being restored to power and putting down their enemies. Like, you can find those sorts of narrative journeys throughout other cultures, not to minimalise the significance of this one to the Romans, but
no, and it is interesting because it casts Rome in a very violent light.
Yeah,
and in that sense, it can serve a very distinct purpose in terms of conceptualization of self.
Yes.
And also open them up to various types of criticism as ideas change.
And even though these are old stories, the thing is that we have to, you know, take into consideration is also, I mean, Livy, obviously being one of our main sort of sources for this story, but at the same time, the time that Livy was writing, he may have had a motive for presenting the story in the way that he did, because it's certainly not exactly the same as the story we get in, you know, Greek retellings like in Plutarch or...
No, and there's obviously specific details of the narrative that have been expanded, embellished on, taken from other sources.
Yes. And
a lot of our sources prior to Livy are fragmentary on this sort of stuff. But, you know, we get aspects of this coming through in Ovid. Yes. Dionysius of Halicarnassus gives us another version of this story as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the essential elements, you know, remain the same. You know, the twins, the founding, la la la. But Livy really, I was reading this really interesting article where he also talked about the fact that Livy really foregrounds Romulus's actions. You know, he's the one who takes the initiative, rather than, say, in Plutarch, Numitor taking the initiative in a lot of the, you know, their connections later on in life, you know, and Numitor and Plutarch sort of, you know, gives them supplies to found a city and sort of provides the initiative, whereas in...
That's not very exciting as a story. Forget that.
And the fact that Livy kind of seems to be qualifying Romulus' success by saying, well, even if this whole divine connection to Mars and this whole, or even the connection to Numitor, even if it is invented, in light of his actions, we may as well sort of believe it in a sense. And maybe that's a slight reference to Augustus, because Augustus, of course, you know, Livy lives through much of that change that comes about when Augustus comes into power, and the idea that Augustus was also sort of overseeing this change. You know, he's essentially sort of instilling a kingship. You know, what will be a kingship again.
Ooh, dangerous territory.
Exactly, I'm going there. And that's the idea that's what Romulus was essentially doing once he'd established his city, introducing this, you know, this monarchy. And perhaps there were some, you know, little, you know, things there to maybe say, well, maybe we should just go with Augustus's claims that he's descended from Venus and all that kind of stuff, because his actions are impressive enough to back that up.
And this is something I think that Livy struggles with as much as anybody, is this transition from what is clearly a religious and so this divine explanation for events, and his idea of rationality as a historian, and somebody who has to write, or set himself up to write a history of Rome from the founding of the city, where the stories are coming out of oral culture, they're coming out of piecemeal source material,
Yes.
and they're tied up to ideas about conceiving the universe in ways that don't necessarily manifest very well as part of reality.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's interesting how in Livy you also get that real sort of dynamic between the country and like rustic living and the city and what the city means, you know. In later versions, again, it's not so much of an issue because they kind of just roll with whatever, you know, works with the story sort of thing. But in this one, it's almost like there is that harking back to the rustic, pure simplicity of the countryside and what that means for people who grow up there, like Romulus and Remus, as opposed to people who continue to live in a city like Amulius. And does that have something to do with Augustus's whole moral reforms and that sort of thing? Because it's at that time that we do get that sort of, you know, harking back to simpler time, you know.
Yeah,
Of, you know, with the Augustus' sort of very ostentatious display about, you know, my women folk still spin and weave. And,
it's all of the traditional behaviours that they engage in.
Absolutely. Even though what they're doing is so unconventional.
Yeah. And in a way it becomes a really important narrative for Augustus because he doesn't really have that. Like, he's not really that healthy an individual. He doesn't really participate in that sort of country lifestyle.
No, I don't think anyone ever said of Augustus, my, what a splendid physical specimen
How
you are.
robust.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
Apart from people maybe looking at his statues.
I don't think they did.
No.
I think he's far more impressive in stature than he is in reality. But he spent a lot of his life ill.
Yeah. Particularly during crucial points.
Really crucial moments in history.
Like Actium, you know.
Yeah.
The battle that settled the Civil War, whatever.
I'm just going to be in bed, guys. There's this really crucial moment in the 20s as well where he's quite ill and it really would have helped if he wasn't, I think. Nevertheless, we get this sense that, like, Augustus is really interested in positioning Roman traditions in particular ways. And I guess the question is, how much can Livy be seen as a vehicle for that sort of thing? Because clearly he buys into some of it, but...
And that's the thing, I think he
on the other
struggles
hand,
with it a little bit.
Yeah,
exactly.
like a foundation story like this really sets the bar low in terms of what is required from a Roman man, and indeed what is expected of Roman women.
And it's an oddly timely narrative. Like, I don't think I would have actually thought as deeply about it until I read this article about, you know, Romulus, as you say, sort of gradually packaging together what his position is going to be and what the position of other people in his society was it going to be. Augustus really was doing the same thing, even though he might deny it.
He's doing a bit of a repackaging process.
He is, and he might not have, you know, obviously he would never have called it a monarchy, and it's only later, I suppose, that we can really look and say, okay, yeah, that's really what he's done. Yeah. But he is essentially just packaging stuff together, repositioning people a little bit, you know. It's kind of a similar experience. So it's funny how, even though it's this mythical tale from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Oh, actually, I suppose we should mention the date.
The founding of the city, 753 BCE.
Yeah, so hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And yet, it can still speak to what, you know, people
I don't think there's any virtue in considering these narratives without thinking about how they're positioning us to think about the time which the authors are actually engaging with these stories.
Yeah.
The Romulus and Remus story is important to the Romans. Livy spends a good deal of time on it.
Yeah.
But it's got conflict and it doesn't sit well with the way that Romans want to think about themselves to a certain extent.
Which I think actually is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
For when we look back and think about the Romans.
Yes.
We don't want them going, woo! Yeah.
Probably for the best.
Yeah, exactly.
And on that note...
Indeed, perhaps we should
yes.
Our dues. Next time, we'll be considering the second king of Rome.
You thought this was about repackaging. Wait for it.
Yeah, exactly. Until then...
Farewell.